What's up, Bog? What's up, Bog? What's up, baby? Bog, where are the fish? I bet you got one of these tied up for spring. Ta-da! Jig City, boys. What's going on, guys? Welcome to mikeybalzz Fishing. Everybody say what's up to Bog. Bog, you gotta fix your ear, dude. There you go. So in this video, we're gonna talk about a lure that I think probably any angler almost anywhere across the country like that fishes for bass has tied up for pre-spawn bass as well as like throughout spring, and that's a jig. But one thing that I try to do in these videos, I don't know if you guys know, but a lot of the inspiration or the ideas I get to make these videos comes from mistakes that I make or things that I forget or stupid things that I do. And I'm like, man, you know, if I'm doing that, I bet you somebody else is making that mistake or forgetting about that technique or that way to fish that lure or something like that. So I always try to highlight, you know, from my personal perspective, maybe you guys are probably smarter than me and you remember all this stuff, but there's a couple things that you can do with a jig and a wobble head. We're going to talk about that I don't think guys really remember, and they're great ways to fish those lures that work in spring. Jigs are killer in spring. Everybody throws them, but there's a reason for it. It's because they work. It's like the net rig, dude. Everybody throws it, but it continues to work. So reimagining how you do that, or remembering kind of little tweaks and nuances that you can do to kind of change that presentation, but still use that same presentation that works and catches bigs in spring, can really put you an edge above the rest. So today, in this video, we're going to talk about my stupid mistake that I always forget to do with a jig that is a killer technique and actually allows you to cover water better and probably tap into some fish that other guys aren't catching. So stay tuned. I think you're going to like this video. Everybody say what's up to Downward Bog. Yes, you do the yoga. Good yoga, Bog. Let's talk fishing. So here's how we're going to run through this video. I'm going to show you the trailers to use for some of these techniques, as well as the jigs and the rod and reel setups that I recommend. And I think the biggest thing is we're going to talk about this technique. So let's kind of get into it. So like I said, everybody has a jig tied on, which I am everybody. I have a jig tied on. This is actually a half ounce with it's a round rubber skirt. I'm still in Florida, but this is something that I'll do maybe with more. Let me show you guys. I have more of like a finesse style jig, kind of something that's a little smaller hook. This is the stand-up version actually as well. These are both Boss jigs, and then I tie my own skirts for them, except for the round rubber. But everybody has one tied up, especially when I go back to Gunnersville and that, because a lot of these lakes, you know, we've seen a lot more anglers out this year, which is really cool, but that means lakes get more pressure, so you got to kind of, I don't know, modify the way you do things. You can't do things the same way you've always done them. Bog, are you invading this video? Can I talk? Thank you, but we need to talk about jigs. So the classic way to fish this jig right here, it's got little kind of kickers. That's a Flappy Daddy, a Gambler Flappy Daddy. But basically, you know, you shoot it out there. If you're on rocks, structure, shoot it out there and you drag it back, whether you like to drag along the side to keep bottom contact, or whether you like to drag up, you know, at like a 45 and kind of work that jig back. Pretty standard. You know, it's a slower presentation. You're trying to make that jig kind of like rock across the cover. Like I said, whether it's rock, whether you got timber or something along those lines. Even if you don't use a football jig, like say it's a grass jig, you know, you're just trying to work it slowly through that cover. Now here's the key though. You know, in spring, oftentimes the trick is covering water to find that pot of fish, because a lot of these pre-spawn fish, they get in little groups because their goal is to come in and spawn. You know, they're making their way in. And even for fish that are like staging, which is kind of that little window right before they spawn, they're in groups too, because they're sort of cruising. We're actually in a great example. There's some grass here, but it's the same concept. If you get on like Gunnersville or some of those lakes up north, you'll have kind of like a break, and they'll be like hard bottom and stuff like that, and those jokers are cruising back and forth. So one thing that you can do with a jig that I literally always forget, and it's stupid, I remembered it actually today because I caught a few fish offshore doing it on a couple shell bars, is taking this jig and treating it more like a crankbait. It's actually, and we're going to talk about wobble heads because that's something you can do this with too, but basically you take this jig, you slang it out there, and instead of doing your drag, your worming style technique, you're actually slow reeling it. Now the key to this though is you're always trying to keep that jig on the bottom, so it's just kind of gradually working its way across the bottom and bumping every piece of hard cover, rock, wood, whatever you got down there. It's kind of just digging its way along. And it really, like from an analogy standpoint, you almost fish it kind of like a sinking crankbait. And that bait just moves along the bottom, And really it allows you to cover water, but at the same time be a little more finesse, a little slow, like in your presentation, I guess. We talked about it with the swim bait fishing in an earlier video. So it's a power fishing technique, but it's a slower, more nuanced presentation, and it involves one of the most renowned lures in bass fishing that catches big fish. I mean, everybody, whether they're hashtag pro or not, knows that a jig does catch some bigger fish. You might not get as many bites, but you do catch some bigger fish on a jig, and I will attest to that. But it's kind of a cool technique because it allows you to cover some more water. You're not dragging, and for as much as these fish see a jig super often, they don't often see it moving. And that's actually what leads to our other technique, and I think that's why this developed. So that football head is a great hard cover, hard bottom technique. And another bait that you can use in this pre-spawn and kind of spring period to do the exact same thing is a wobble head. And a wobble head is simply this. This is actually a wrecking ball. It's a Gambler wrecking ball. And the reason I like these is you just buy the weight. So you buy that football head, and then that's like a super heavy duty split ring on them because I've opened split rings. But you put a split ring on it, and then you choose the hook that you want to use. That's a 4/0 owner wide gap plus. This is a 1/2 ounce. You can do it all the way down to 3/8. I'm actually going to tell you kind of a cool technique you can do with that. And I got to send a shout out to my buddy Walt at Halo. He taught me how to do this. And actually, structure wise, my buddy Joe Semler taught me how to do it. It's kind of, I did not figure this out. They showed me how to do it and taught me about it, and I loved it, so I kept doing it. So basically though, this is the same concept. You would drag this joker across the bottom, but using your reel and not your rod tip. You're just slow reeling it so it bumps everything on the bottom. And what's really cool about a wobble head versus the football is you have that free floating trailer, so you actually get some shimmy back and forth, almost like a crankbait. And you guys are going to immediately notice, we're gonna talk about trailers in a second, but you'll notice I have a swim bait on there. You get that nice swim bait tail on there, and it's almost like slow rolling a swim bait on the bottom. It's sort of like a crankbait action fused with a swim bait. You get this cool little rocking action. It's perfect for fishing a little bit slower, but at the same time power fishing. And it definitely catches some big ones. You can play around with your swim bait size. You'll notice I have something pretty small in there. The fish I've been targeting have been super duper moody. That's a little easy. I would recommend though, we'll talk about trailers in the end, like if I'm using swim baits though, it's probably gonna be the little easy or the easy swimmer. Hollow bodies on that style hook, on an offset shank hook, you have trouble with hookups, and then you have trouble with the bait staying correct. So using a full body, maybe a Kitech might actually work. But those are kind of the two things that I will do this reeling sort of jig technique with. Now the other fun thing that you can do is, with the wobble head especially, is you can almost fish it like a swim jig. Like I said, this is a 1/2 ounce right here, but I have in my back compartment some more stuff to make some up, and I have 3/8 and I have 1/4. So my buddy Walt from Halo actually taught me a cool technique on Gunnersville for pre-spawn as well as kind of post-spawn fish you can do as the grass comes up. And you can take the same wobble head style deal, and instead of keeping it on the bottom like you would with the jig, you actually reel it like a swim jig, and you treat it sort of like a wobble-headed swim jig, and you can throw it around, say if you got some stumps sticking out. Even if we have some shallow grass. This is a little too shallow right here, but we got some shallow grass right here. If you have some shallow eel grass, you throw it out there, especially with like a 1/4 ounce, and you reel it just slow enough so it ticks, and then if you ever get hung, you kind of pop it off. I actually caught one of the bigger fish kind of early pre-spawn last year up by Scottsboro doing that, a 5-pounder in like 2 feet of water in a community hole too. There were like 3 other boats around me fishing the exact same stuff, and I ended up catching I think 5 or 6 like 2-pounders, and then like a 5 and change doing it. We're going to talk about trailers though, because that is something you can play with. But 2 ways to fish that wobble head, reeling it on the bottom, or fishing it more like a swinging swim jig. Reel it over your grass or through your timber fields, things along those lines. And then reeling the football jig. Use just enough weight to kind of keep you on the bottom and slow roll it, but never let it stop moving, or maybe give it a pause from time to time, but just keep kind of a slow pulsated retrieve, but make sure you're staying on the bottom with it. It's a presentation that they don't see, and it's 2 extra casts that you can make. You're already fishing that jig sometimes, you're casting it out there, you're dragging it back, literally make 1 more cast, and just reel it back with some bottom bouncing. And that's kind of what I was talking about with mistakes. So a mistake that I'll make is I'll be out on like a bar or a pre-spawn point or something, and I'll be like, I'm going to throw my jerk bait, I'm going to throw my crankbait, I'm going to throw my chatterbait, my spinnerbait or whatever, and then I'm going to throw a jig and drag a jig and I'm leaving. And then I forget, well, there's 4 different retrieves I can do with each one of these baits. And I'm not saying you have to do all of them, but it's important when you're out there fishing, especially when you're not getting bites, to take the things that you already have, rigged up on your deck, already tied up, and use them for their full potential. Like, reel the freaking jig, all it takes is like a 2-minute more cast. And especially with this technique, because you can actually keep the bait moving, cast it out there and reel it, dude. Like, that's one of those ways that you figure out little kind of nuanced bites, little sort of tweaks to the pattern of the presentation that really get you an extra couple bites or maybe catch you a big one for the day. So let's talk setups real quick on this, because it's pretty straightforward, and then we'll get into trailers. On the football jig deal, I go super traditional. This is a 7-foot Halo TI, a super simple medium heavy rod, super standard. I like the 7-foot with the football jig because I can make accurate casts, a little tighter casts, because sometimes I'll do this around bridges, around trees. I'll kind of walk it back from the bank, if there's like a stump field or like a few stumps coming down. So I want to be able to make accurate casts. I like the action on the 7-foot as well. It's a little bit softer. I am playing with this. This is a Daiwa. I think it's the XS100. It's like $249 on Tackle Warehouse. It's a little more expensive Daiwa that I'm trying. I'll put links to all this stuff at Tackle Warehouse as well. This is an 821. It's probably a little fast. I've tried to slow down, but I'm not keeping the bait on the bottom as much as I want. A 721, like your standard kind of high-speed reel, is probably perfect. Line is tricky. So I got 15-pound fluorocarbon on because I'm kind of a utility guy. That'll work in 90% of the situations. If you want to play around with it, I'd go less versus more, unless you're fishing super shallow, 12-pound test, something along those lines. But I will warn you, the bites you get with this, these jokers knock it. I don't know if they're like following it or what, but when you're slow reeling it, it's kind of like that bite you get like on a slow rolled spinnerbait. Like, you're just reeling and you just feel the blades, or you feel the bottom kind of, like bouncing, and it'll be like boom, like they were behind it waiting, and then they just crunched it. So they really do hammer it. So having a little heavier line is, I think, kind of smart, because they smoke the bait, dude. Like, so you want a little bit of beef, but not too much, because you want that bait to get down a little bit deeper. On the Wobble Head, I do it a little bit different. So the Wobble Head, this is a 1/2 ounce, but I'll do this for like 3/8, 3/4, whatever. I got it on a KS2 right here. This is a 7.2 medium heavy. The KS2s are a little bit softer tip rod, but in general, no matter what rod you're using, I'd use a little longer rod on the Wobble Head, because you want to make as long of a cast possible. I'm usually throwing it on more open stuff or flats, even when I'm reeling it over stuff, grass, stumps, and all those things. And I like that softer tip, that slightly slower tip, just because it loads up a little bit better. When you're fishing it like a swim jig, or even when you are reeling it out on the bottom, for some reason, like the jig, they tend to whack. The Wobble Head, they'll whack it, but they tend to sometimes you can just get weight bites, I guess you could say. And especially when you're reeling it over stuff, sometimes you don't really feel a bite. It just kind of loads up, and that softer tip gives you a little bit of insurance policy if you're not like totally focused in and catch the bite. So those are the setups, both with 15-pound test. Pretty standard. I think you're throwing your jig on that stuff anyway, so it's not really a setup thing that you need to tweak. We talked about the swim baits. On the Wobble Head, let's run through trailers there first. On the Wobble Head, I actually really like a little easy. You can do them in different colors. Don't sit on white. I know a lot of guys don't like throwing like white stuff on jig style trailers. Don't sit on white, and I'll even show you that on this guy too. I have classic jig trailer, a twin tail grub. I'm a fan of like kind of a little smaller, more compact things, but a white twin tail on like a smoked jig, football jig or something like that. Yeah, like people don't do that. Those fish do not see that, especially along the bottom, kind of bumping along. Definitely a different presentation. Like if you got shad, if you got stuff like that, if you can throw a crankbait that's like white or shad looking on the bottom, you can catch fish doing this, dude. So some other ones, depending on your water temperature, so kind of like a quiet one. You guys have seen this on my finesse jigs before. A BB Cricket, you're not going to get a ton of action or a ton of kicking from it. And I think that's actually a good thing, especially when you get into waters like, say, 55, well, 54, 52 and below. The subtlety and appendages are almost like non-kicking appendages, like those little cylindrical things, are almost more important than anything, because the bait does sway a bit in the water when you're reeling it. The plastic does, the trailer. So you do get some action. If your water's a little more active, though, one of my favorites, I don't even know, I got one right here. Dude, hands down, if you got bigger fish or, you know, like 3 to 5, 3 to 6 pounders, freaking Mega Daddy. This is one of my favorites, especially on the football jig for reeling. Even though it's got these big paddles, it has a super subtle kind of, like, I don't know, waving action. And you'll notice on this one, I modded it. That claw usually comes out a bunch more. I cut them down. If I want something a little more subtle, I also, you know, clip the thing off, because I like making these into chunks, but I clip the paddles down to make them a little more subtle. So you can do a ton of mods to these trailers, basically, to get the exact action that you want. A classic one, caught a bunch of freaking smallmouth on this joker, and it works good for reeling because it has a nice kind of waving action, is the NetBait packet chunk right there. What's really kind of interesting too is I like these chunks because the less plastic you actually put on this jig, the better it stays down. And for the most part, I'm doing this technique, except when I'm doing the Wobble Head, like over the grass pretty much, I'm doing this technique down on the bottom. And less plastic means I'm able to keep bottom contact at a slower retrieve speed, so it makes my job easier. If you guys want to get crazy with finesse stuff, these are some things I'm going to try up at Gunnersville as the water clears up and we get into spring. These are HD High Def Craws. If nothing else, even if like the fish don't know it's a crayfish, I think it's cool looking, dude. Like, these things are beautiful, and I got some in Magic Crawl, basically. They're super realistic. I'll show you one on a jig that I got set up right here. But, dude, check that out. Like, that is cool. I will note to you, though, if you put them on a jig, you got to cut off that back, this thing right here. Just cut it right there so you have kind of like a worm chunk to stick it in. But super... Dude, it's super cool looking. If the fish don't freaking think it's cool, I think it's cool. It gives me more confidence to throw. Then, lastly, kind of a Wisconsin technique. Don't sit on a skirted grub. You don't always have to have a skirt on your football jig. I don't even know if I'm able to get this thing out because I'm making a mess. So if you want to just run a standard football jig without a skirt, you can take a skirted grub and do literally the exact same presentation. It already has those twin tails on the back, and you just reel it along the bottom. It's awesome on smallmouth. I know up in Wisconsin it was a big deal, and you can get them in a bunch of different colors. Usually I like a different skirt color versus the tails, but these are the ones that I had left because I had some brown ones. But that's pretty much the presentations. Really, those are the things that I put on the back. You can put anything on the back, dude. Like, but just mix up. I think the biggest thing is mix up like your whites or your bait colors versus your dark colors, and play with that mixture, because there is something to be said for doing like a football jig in white or smoke and reeling it along the bottom, because they just don't see it that much. So it really mixes up that presentation. But it is a cool technique to try, and it works from, I'd say, like early spring pre-spawn through like the spawn when they're staging. Like, you can do this this Wobble Head over the grass kind of thing. It's kind of a cool way to fish if you're in some swim jig water that's semi-sparse and you want a different presentation that's a little less bulky than a swim jig that fishes a little cleaner. You can do this. It's pretty cool. Like, and you can change your hooks to use different baits and stuff. It's a fun technique. Thank you, Walt. I enjoy fishing that deal. But you can also do it through post-spawn. You know, down in Florida, I catch a bunch. That's where Joe taught me how to do it. I'm fishing bars in, like, say, 10 to 20 feet, and those fish will move out post-spawn. They're really moody. Some days they'll bite a crankbait, but sometimes they can be super lethargic. And you take that Wobble Head, and you just slow reel it along the bottom in the same, like, area or the same place or line you'd fish that crankbait, and you get some friggin' magnum bites. Plus your hookup, well, not your hookup ratio, but your landing ratio, because you're dealing with, like, I love this hook. This Owner Wygat Plus is, in my opinion, one of the best hooks out there for an offset shank hook. And when I hook them on it, they're not coming off. So one hook, you get a little more guarantee. But it's a cool technique. Give it a try. If you guys got anything to add to that technique, drop it down in the comments box. I will put links to everything that I talked about in the description box at Tackle, so you can go take a look if you want to learn more about like specs on the products or whatever you need to find out. See if it actually, you can get stuff size-wise that applies to your water. But give it a try. It's always good to think about sort of mistakes or things that we forget out on the water and reflect on that, so the next time you go out, you can sort of, I don't know, give that a try. All it takes is one cast, right? You never know when that big one's gonna bite, and making one more cast with the jig, and instead of dragging it back, reeling it back and bouncing the bottom. Like, it can be that simple. They're fish, bro. Like, always remember that. Fish are fish. They're not that smart, even though we think they are sometimes. They're about as smart as Bog. But Bog is pretty smart. Come here, Bog. We got to wrap this video up. Everybody throw a like and subscribe for Bog. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I like highlighting stuff that I make mistakes about and, like, forget out in the water. So, because I think in reality, you know, we don't think the same, but we're always trying to improve our game. And by highlighting and reflecting and being critical of ourselves and the way we fish, sometimes we can help others. So that's a mistake I make. If it helps you out, great. If not, have a great day fishing. Keep the lines tight. Thank you guys for watching. Tight lines. We'll see you next time back out on the water.